Thank you, Sanjin.
It's so far. It feels like so impersonal. I'm going to sit a little closer.
Okay, I could sit here, but no. Who knows? Okay, let's have a short conversation about what we heard. I'm sure there will be questions from the audience. I have like 10 to 15 of my own, but I will not use them all, so you can start preparing your own thoughts. Sanjin, you mentioned the word deployment several times. What does it mean in reality? What are people doing specifically right now? Or let me rephrase, what should the people in this audience start doing tomorrow?
They should start doing proof of concepts. One of the really interesting things about this technology is typically when we do proof of concepts, they kind of take like 8 weeks to do, 12 at the most, 4 at the fastest. We are now able to do proof of concepts in like 2 weeks sometimes, right? Really, really quickly, because you can use something like the OpenAI playground. Even that simple thing, you can use it to quickly prove out a concept. And what that means, you can de-risk it very, very quickly. But actually, the step to get to MVP can actually take a little bit longer because oftentimes you're using systems you've never connected before. But actually, the reality is there's very few like at-scale deployment. I think Bain has done only one, which is for Coca-Cola with their big marketing campaign earlier this year. So like the best practices for like what at-scale deployment looks, nobody knows because everybody's very much in like that MVP stage. Everybody builds like a simple web interface for this and just kind of hands it to people. And the goal is to prove out the value before you commit to building like a really big product.
Yeah. You also talked about one of the slides before this one where you showed the big map of things which are new and happening every time. I remember when the GPT-4 came out, we were all browsing through Twitter feeds every day, searching for disruptive news, and there were many. Until when should we be behaving like this? I mean, is it sustainable to wake up every morning and look at the Twitter feed and, bump your head?
It's not. It really isn't, because I feel like the hype cycle went from like months to weeks to days, and then about 2 months ago, it went to hourly hype feed, where like each tech company was trying to like one up the other. We're like, check out my LLM versus your LLM. And it's really just like not sustainable. And one of the things that you learn quickly when you start doing it is that a lot of the things that you see on Twitter are exaggerated. And really like the best thing to do is to just start playing with it, right? And learn for yourself, right? Because a lot of the stuff that you see on there, they're kind of they're not doctored, but they're often picking like the best or the worst possible example of what you can do.
Yeah, Kelsey said yesterday that when we think about innovation cycles, yes, they are short, but only if you are not paying attention. So that's why I'm asking, how do we sustainably pay attention and stay sane?
I mean, there's so much hype, right? And every Silicon Valley startup is trying to get their share of the hype, and the way to do it is by like creating like really bombastic Twitter things and pretending like it's organic, which it's not. It's all like well-orchestrated marketing campaigns that look like it's organic.
Yeah. So most of the people in the audience, they belong to some kind of organization in which they build software.
Yeah.
So there are different roles here, people who are doing business analysis, people who are doing development, architecture, and so on. You mentioned earlier that the impact is not really like 100% more productivity, but less. But I assume it's not the same for all the roles in the software factory. What are you seeing in the market? Where does it add more value? Where does it add less value? Are there any specific types of activities in the software factory where we should be using it like now?
Yeah, I think it adds the most value for like the front-end developers. Again, it's a small fraction of what they do is coding. And if you look at other research from other fields, it tends to help the most junior people the most, right? So like what it means is that, and then the second way it helps is actually it exposes new APIs that people may not be aware of that are actually like a better way to do something, right? The second most helpful place where we see it being helpful is in documentation, which is like it just helps actually like pre-write a lot of documentation for you. And potentially, in a lot of cases, we see it can write like really good test cases as well, which means that like not only do you write your test cases quicker, but actually like they're often better because it's thinking about things to test for that you wouldn't test otherwise.
You mentioned junior developers. Do we still need those people?
Of course. I mean, play this forward, right? Like, in a world in which you decide to stop hiring junior developers, at some point your senior developers retire, who replaces them, right? I think everybody here is aware, I think I said like 7 times in this presentation, like there needs to be a human in the loop. Like, do not let an LLM go directly to the customer. I hope that's clear. So I think everybody understands that. What hasn't been well understood in the market yet is, yes, but that person overseeing it actually has to be an expert in the field, right? If it's a non-expert in the field, they'll read the response and they'll be like, yeah, that seems plausible.
Let's commit.
And it is plausible, it's also wrong, right? And I've seen this happen at Bain because, like, our junior consultants will use it to get answers, and I'm like, that's not right. That seems plausible, but that's actually not right. So like what the developers are going to keep doing is like, it's actually not that different from like the revolution from like writing assembly to compiled languages, right? 40 years ago, most people write like things in assembly. And then compilers came around and they translated like high-level language into compiled language. This is very similar to that, right? Except now you'll be programming kind of using like human language. But the hard part of programming isn't figuring out how to take your idea into code. That's frankly busy work. The hard part is figuring out like how you want to do it, like how do you architect it and all of this other stuff, which means that, like, your more junior people will now actually kind of be required to act like mini architects. There's that. There's also testing, right? Making sure like what you built actually is working.
Now that we have junior developers using this confident bullshitter, let's call
That's
it
right.
that.
Yeah.
And since we are in Europe, I need to ask you a difficult question, and that one is about regulation, of course. What do you see happening in the field regarding regulation? I know most of your practice comes from US, and maybe there's a different sentiment towards regulation there, but how do you feel about that?
There is, and I think it's a nuanced answer by modality. And I think a useful analogy is kind of what happened to Google in early 2000s. I think most of us have forgotten this, but Google was getting sued a bunch in early 2000s for scraping websites, right? Websites were saying you aren't allowed to do that in order to make your search engine better. And by the time all of these lawsuits made it to the various Supreme Courts in various countries, like, people have used Google so much that, like, as a society, we just kind of agree that, like, this is so valuable to have that we're just going to agree that this is like allowable use, right? So I think, I don't know, something similar is going to happen here, where I think for text, it's probably going to be okay, right, in terms of you are allowed to use the common crawl to train this. When it comes to like images, audio, and video, I think that's where like real restrictions are going to take place, because that's where you potentially really are stealing somebody's work. That's the best I can, like, look, it's too soon to say anything else about it, but that's probably how it's going to play out. But like, look, this is fast-moving technology. I've spoken with a lot of confidence, but we have to have like a certain level of humility that like nobody really knows. And people who are telling you they know what's going on are either delusional or lying.
When we are talking, for example, to our clients about using these things like ChatGPT or Copilot in our joint projects, the topic that will very soon be on the table is, are we allowed to use, for example, Copilot on their projects without having explicit acceptance from them? Do you see these kinds of conversations happening already in your practice, and
they're happening so much less in the US. Some companies are more conservative, and they're thinking about, like, do we have to like label which piece of code was AI assisted versus not? But even the companies who are like beginning to think about that are being like, this is not sustainable. We're just going to like use it and move forward, right? It's just like not sustainable. Like, what's next? Like, you'll have to certify that any piece of code wasn't copied over from Stack Overflow, like, which is what you do today, right? It's basically just removing the step of going to Stack Overflow, and instead it's just giving you what Stack Overflow would have given you, but tailored for what you need.
And then if we are afraid, or if people are afraid, is it the right way to maybe start to build your own models and train them locally somehow, or is that a bad practice?
Again, I have to give like a very nuanced answer there. I think a lot of tech companies, or like a lot of software companies who pride themselves on like being like tech forward, have this instinct to build their own LLM because you can. And I think for right now, it's probably the wrong instinct, right? Because there's a lot of hype about how all these open source LLMs are almost as good as OpenAI. But if you actually like read each research paper, and I have read most of them, they're always comparing as GPT-3 or a DES 3.5. And that's cool, but GPT-4 is like way, way, way better than that. So they're kind of picking a really low bar to compare themselves against. I think a day will come, and that day will probably be in 3 years, where you'll be able to train your own open source LLM. That's actually pretty good for most things. But the day isn't today. And if you spend all of your scarce development effort in developing your own LLM, you aren't going to be building applications. You're going to be like essentially doing the equivalent of like rewriting scikit-learn for machine learning. It's just like the idea, like there'll be time for it, but that time is probably not right now. Like the time right now is to just build actually a product with it. And we generally, like, even though GPT-4 is very, very expensive to use, we always start with GPT-4, and then we figure out, like, well, for which one of these tasks can you actually drop down to a cheaper model? Because actually, GPT 3.5, it's so cheap that, like, I have not seen an ROI that tells me that, like, building your own is a better ROI. Now, there may be a privacy reason to do it, but as far as ROI, you know, like, you probably can replicate at 3.5, but in the long term, it's going to be way more expensive. But in 3 years, when the silicon gets better and kind of open source models get better, you know, you'll be able to.
I just want to join this smart table. You can continue now.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
We are keeping people away from coffee, and I know people here love their coffee.
You don't want enemies.
But we have a continuation in the afternoon, after lunch. There is an additional panel discussion on AI. Sanjin will be taking part in it. So
yeah.
This is a nice way to ask you to come after lunch to this panel session, please. So we will stop this now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.